positivity around the world by sharing inspiring life experiences. With me today is a woman who lived 35 years not knowing the truth about her father's death until this shocking discovery changed everything. As usual, we aim to motivate, educate, and inspire you. So if you're here, grab your warm drinks and let's kick the ball rolling. Hello, Lisa, and welcome to Podcast with Sheila.
Hi, Sheila. So happy to be here.
It's an absolute delight. Would you like to introduce yourself to our audience before we kick the ball rolling?
Absolutely. So I'm here in the Boston area. I'm about 17 miles north of Boston in Salem, Massachusetts. It's where I live. It's where I work. And I'm a lot of different things that all kind of converge around mental health and wellness. So you mentioned when you introduced me that I do have a past history with suicide loss. I'm a three-time suicide loss survivor, and you did touch on the one that was probably the most profound, the loss that really kind of pushed me in the direction of the that my work is in now. That was losing my father when I was 10, and what I was told at the time was that my father had had a heart attack, but the truth eventually came out 35 years later, and I learned that it was a suicide. And uh, the year before my father passed away, I lost a cousin to suicide, and about 4 years ago, a very close childhood friend. So all of those experiences kind of shifted the trajectory of the work that I do. I've always been a content creator. I write books. I was in the parenting space for a really long time, writing parenting books, and this just put me in a different place completely, mentally, emotionally, physically, put me in a different body of work. And after learning about my father's suicide, I really just, I think, when the pieces kind of got put back together, I found myself in an advocacy role. I found myself wanting to be the person on the other end of the telephone that people would call to talk to, and to hopefully give hope to people who we're in the same situation that maybe my father was in. So all my work has changed now. The books I write, the content that I create is all focused on suicide awareness and prevention and telling your story and being vulnerable with people and giving people permission to share their own lived experience, because everybody has a story.
Well, I'm happy we are talking about mental health today. It looks like this is a topic that is not discussed very much, but there's a lot going on in
Mm.
people's lives which is affecting their mental health. So I'm glad we're talking about it. But before we delve deeper into that, um, I believe when your father died, you were a child, and that is why they had to make the whole story about his death a little bit different.
Yeah.
Would you have preferred that you were told he had committed suicide at that age, or are you happy now, looking with hindsight, thinking it was right for them to have told me what they told me, and now realizing the real cause of his death?
It's interesting. Nobody's ever asked me that question before, so I really appreciate that you asked that, because it's making me think of things in different terms. I know myself, and I know at that time in my life, I absolutely don't believe that I could have handled knowing that my father had taken his life. I believed at that time. You got to remember, this was 1978 when my father passed away. So people weren't equipped to have conversations about mental illness, about suicide, certainly weren't equipped to have them with kids. I was a 10-year-old child at the time. So, I know myself, and the way that I believed suicide was a selfish act, which was a very common belief system back in those days. I think if I had known that my own father had died by suicide, I think I don't think I could have come back from that. It was so difficult. I remember so vividly just the feelings around just his loss, just that he wasn't there anymore, that he was absent now from my life, from our family. And to have known at that age, without any support in place, that it was a suicide, I think it would have taken me down, to be quite honest with you. But the only reason, so I'm very grateful to my mother for changing that story and protecting me, which is exactly what she did. But at the same time, I wish that I could have been there for my mother. My mother kept that secret, not just from me. My mother kept that secret from the world. No one knew for 35 years that my father had died by suicide. And for her, even though she was immersed in taking care of me, and she went back to college late in life, and she was working, and she was super busy, a million balls in the air, she didn't have anyone to talk to, didn't have anyone to share the weight of that. And I can't imagine. I mean, I have two daughters, and my two daughters are the world to me, and imagine um, I can't imagine dealing with that, and not sharing it with them or being able to support them. And I just wished I could have been there in that moment at that time to be able to support my mother.
Yeah, I think that that is really amazing for you to say you would have wished that you were there for your mother. And for me, recently, my children have been there for me. And when I look back, because when you just mentioned she didn't have anybody to talk to, I felt that was me. Because I
Mm,
have very little to no friends at all. I have a lot of acquaintances, but I do not have a friend. And
mm,
when I'm going through things and I'm not able to share with anybody, the immediate people who are around me are my children. I have two children. I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they have a mind of their own. And I think that sometimes, yeah, sometimes I think God gave them to me for times like these. They just
mm,
understand me. And when I tell people, oh, I told my children, so why did you tell them? They are children, but they know. Even when you don't tell them, they know. And they know how
yeah.
to handle, and the kind of advice they give me, I'm shocked. I'm wondering, are these really children, or are they adults in children's body? You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
I
Yes.
do. Yeah, I do. Yeah, we don't give our kids enough credit, I think,
Yeah.
in that
And
way.
yeah, and I'm beginning to think that a child in the 70s is absolutely different from a child now.
Oh, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure. It's a different world, entirely different world.
They understand these things, they process it easily, and
Mm.
they can tell you things you are not expecting to hear from children that age.
No,
So
not at all.
yeah, people say keep it away from them. I say tell them and let them have it, let them know about it. Let
Mm,
them make their own decisions and their own judgments and decide and know. And that is how I go about it. So when you were talking about your children now, bringing them into things, I'm thinking that's me. And that's how I'll do it anytime, any day, and
yeah.
not hide it from them. Anyway, let's go back to the story. And many people
Mm,
don't realize that grief can resurface in new ways. What
mm.
was it like to process your father's death again with this new understanding?
It's a very unique position to be in. I mean, I remember so vividly what that pain and that grief and sadness felt like when I was a little girl. I mean, you can remember it to the point where you can taste it, you can smell it, you just remember what it was like so clearly. And I was 35 years past that point in my life. I had already gone to school. I had been married. I had children. I had been married for 20 years at that time. So I was at a very different point in my life. I was a grown woman. And all of a sudden I lost him again at a very different point in my life and in the world, kind of, I guess, the evolution of the world, because we were so much further beyond the understandings of all those things back in those days. Now here we were in this modern world where people were talking openly and honestly about suicide and about mental illness. And so at the same time that I had more tools and I was more mature and I was a grown up, it didn't change the fact that it brought me right back to that moment. It felt like I was 10 years old again. That pain felt identical in so many ways to that original loss. But now I was a suicide survivor. I didn't know what a suicide survivor was or did. I mean, when my cousin took his life, he was a part of my family for sure, but I was young, and the connection with him certainly was nothing like what a connection with your father is like. So I wasn't prepared to deal with that. And it was, there were so many other elements to suicide loss that were just so different. Like, you can't, you can't equate a suicide loss with another kind of loss, because while they're both tragic, any loss is tragic. But when you're talking specifically about a suicide loss, you're you're talking about the why. You're talking about the feelings of guilt. You're talking about what could I have done differently? Could I have stopped this? The feelings of stigma, those aren't attached to other kinds of losses. If someone dies in a car accident or someone dies, by heart attack or cancer, it's tragic, and the grief is still the grief, but you don't have those questions and those other feelings that are attached to it. So it becomes different. It's just the same and different at the same time, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. So your father struggled at a time with mental health, wasn't openly discussed at the time. Mental health wasn't openly. Did you know why he committed suicide? Was that part of the story ever told to you?
No. I mean, we have our suspicions. My father was one of those people who you would never have known that he had had any mental illness. He was the most joyful, loving, hardworking, present man. He was so invested in our family unit. It was just the three of us. I'm an only child, so it was just the three of us, and we were a tight little family unit. And so my father adored my mother. I knew he loved and adored me. And he was just so passionate about everything he did in his life that you would never have thought that he was troubled or that he was mentally ill or depressed. But it, we don't know the ultimate reasons why. It was never in the note that he left. His note was very brief. It was more of just a general goodbye. So those details are really still unknown, and that's hard. That's a hard thing to live with. You have your suspicions. We knew that he was under a tremendous amount of pressure professionally. He had a job. We live north of Boston, so he would commute into the city every day. He had a job that was a full-time responsibility, and he also had another full-time job managing his own family's business. So, I mean, my father was working, 60, 80 hours a week. He was very, very busy. His family was a very difficult family. That's all I can say without being too blunt and too honest. My father's family, you couldn't please them no matter what you did. And my father worked so hard to do everything for the benefit of his family. And it was sad. Even as a 10-year-old kid, I saw how my my father's side of the family treated him. And so I think all of those things kind of combined to really impact his mental health. And then you don't even know what kind of genetic mental illness my father had. There was a lot of that on his side of the family too, but things weren't diagnosed, things weren't talked about. So the answer to your question is that we don't know nearly as much as we wish we did about why he did it or why he did it when he did it.
Yeah. Do you think conversations around mental illness and suicide has evolved over the years?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we have a long way to go because there's still very much a stigma. But the fact that you and I are having this conversation right now and that people are out there hearing it and people are out there having their own conversations, and there are podcasts and platforms now that are dedicated specifically to talking about all these things that have been taboo for so long. I think that we're definitely moving in the right direction. We're still, it's like anything that you're trying to change. It's not easy. It's not
Yeah.
easy. It takes time. It means changing the language that we use to talk about certain things. It means opening up and being vulnerable about certain things. But I think we're on the right track.
Wow. Great, great. So tell us about the Help Hub. What was your vision when creating it, and how does it support those in crisis?
Well, the vision, there was no vision. It was never something that I intended to create. It was something that kind of found me in a strange way. So the Help Hub, for those who don't know, is a platform that I've been building, kind of quietly building for the last year. I launched it about maybe 4 months ago, around the holidays, for the very first time. Launched it, and it's the result of me being on crisis lifelines and giving people resources and support. It's a result of me being a survivor, of course, of me being someone who runs groups that are dedicated to survivors of suicide loss, and just wanting to put people together with the resources that they need whenever they need them. whatever community they're in. I just started accumulating resources and was putting them on my website, and which looked very, very different than the HelpHUB looks today. And little by little, this list became massive, and it had no structure, and everything on it felt valuable to me, but I didn't really know what to do with it all. And eventually I kind of took a step back from it and looked at what it really represented. And it represented so many hundreds and hundreds of organizations and platforms and crisis networks that are out there in the world that support different people in different communities. But when you're in crisis, it's really, really challenging to know what to do. You don't know what you need. You don't know where to go. You don't know what resources you can trust. So you need to have a place where anybody can go who's part of any community and find the resources that are very specific to you. But I couldn't find it. Couldn't find that community. So I ended up kind of unintentionally building that community, and I just rebranded my entire website around. If you go to the HelpHUB, it's at thehelphub.co. And the first thing that you hit when you land on that landing page is it's a grid. There are 16 little thumbnail pictures, and you can click on any one of them. There's a category for grief and loss, category for the LGBTQ community, for the Latinx community, the BIPOC community, veterans, elderly, children, teens. And all you need to do if you're part of one of those communities and you need a specific resource, go click on that image for your category, and that'll take you to a separate page that has a listing of certainly not all, because the internet's a big place, but has the major platforms or support systems within that community for that community. So the feeling behind it was, we all may go through a lot of the same things, but we don't all go through them the same way. Like what you might go through and might affect you a certain way is going to affect me in a different way, maybe based on where we live, based on where we come from, what our background is, what our race is, what everything about us that makes us who we are. We're all a little bit different depending on where we come from, and we need different things to support that. So that's what the HelpHUB became. It became, and I continue to add to it daily. It just became kind of a platform that anybody could access who needed to find resources to support their mental and emotional well-being. And along with it, I created a toolkit section. People can go in and download free. Everything on the website is free. They can download different infographics and information sheets. If you're having a grief attack and you've never had one, you don't know what's going on, you don't know what to do, there's something on there that can guide you through it, can explain what's happening and give you tips on how to deal with it. If you know someone who is struggling and you're afraid that they want to take their life, there are conversation starters. You can go on the HelpHUB and you can find the language to use to talk to people directly and honestly, knowing that you have something to support you in that conversation. So that's what it became. It has a YouTube channel now. I'm launching my own podcast tomorrow. As a matter of fact, that's going to drop. Everything feeds into the HelpHUB. All the content that I write is up there as well, and it's for anyone who needs it whenever they need it.
Wow, I think that is a beautiful project you are on there. And I was nearly going to ask you, what are some of the signs we should look for when you're dealing with somebody and you think they are having suicidal thoughts? And because for some people, you probably might have heard them mutter it a number of times. For others, they would not talk about it at all, cannot even detect it, like in the case of your dad's. So, and because you've dealt with a number of them, are there a few signs we should look out for when you're with somebody that will be telltale signs of the person is having suicidal thoughts or stuff like that?
Yeah, there are so many. And you have to remember, there are two different kinds of people out there in the world. There are the people who are open about it, who will say, I'm not okay. Or you'll have people who maybe we all have that friend who will post on social media that they're not okay, or they'll tell you openly. And then you have people like my dad who are so under the radar that you have absolutely no idea that anything is going on. And those are the people who we have to worry about, I think, the most, because you can't help what you don't know. And if someone's hiding how they feel, you can't help them. So some of the things to look for really are just unusual changes in behavior. Obviously, if someone is saying they don't want to live, or they're contemplating harming themselves, that's one thing. That's kind of a telltale sign. But with other people, maybe you work with someone and their job performance has really changed, or the way they show up has really changed, or someone in whatever area of your life, maybe they're not communicating as much as they used to. Maybe they used to be somebody who really cared about the way they looked, and maybe now they don't really care about the way they look, or they're giving things away, or they're canceling plans, or they just have that, people can sense vibes in people, and maybe their vibe is just off. It's always a reason to have a conversation. It's always a reason to say, are you okay? Like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, are you okay? And I think everyone wants to help. Everybody really wants to be there when someone they know is struggling. But it's scary because, A, what do you say? And B, if they do say, yes, I am struggling, well, now what? What do you do? How do you help someone? And I think that's what concerns a lot of people, and maybe is a barrier for a lot of people who would want to help. And to those people, I would say, it's not your job to fix the person's problem. What you can do that'll be the most beneficial is to listen. Just hold space for that person. Just talk to that person. Ask that person, like, are you okay? And be very direct. Like, are you thinking of harming yourself? Are you thinking of killing yourself? And then you just kind of let them guide the conversation. Just ask them open-ended questions about why they're feeling the way they're feeling. And then the best and most effective thing in the world that any of us can do for anybody we know who's struggling is to encourage them to either call a therapist if they have one, or maybe help them get one if they don't, or call the 988 crisis lifeline, because that suicide and crisis lifeline is free. It's free for anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. It's not just a lifeline that people should call if someone is suicidal. It's anyone who's having any kind of a mental health crisis. And what might be a crisis for me might not be a crisis for you or someone else. But if it's a crisis in your heart and in your mind, then it's worth a phone call, because there are people on the other end who are trained to de-escalate a crisis and to offer support and resources. So those are, those are some of the signs to look out for, and some kind of simple steps you can kind of keep top of mind to use when someone is struggling.
Wow. You believe there is strength in shared experiences. Can you
Mm.
share a story of someone who found hope and healing through your work?
Well, it's interesting. I can't think of any one person, because I think of all the messages that I get constantly. People will slide into my DMs and send me messages and emails, and reach out to me through my website. I actually I've been very fortunate to get a lot of beautiful feedback from people who have either heard me on a podcast, or maybe they've been on my website and they've used something of mine. I guess most recently I found out that, actually my co-host on my podcast is a suicide attempt survivor, and she has been wonderful about sharing the HelpHUB with everybody that she knows, all over her own social platforms. And she did send it to someone whose daughter was struggling, and they had no idea that the 988 lifeline was something that they could use, that they could call. And they did, and it changed the outcome of that person's struggle. It gave them hope. It found them help. And I'm very lucky that I hear a lot of those kinds of stories, as a result of creating this platform and having these kind of conversations. Because you know what I mean, having these kinds of conversations, they're cathartic for me. Like, enjoy talking about these things because I think it's important to put it out in the world. But for other people, it's a point of connection, and it gives people that sense like I'm not alone. I'm not the only one in my own head sitting here struggling and feeling the way I feel. Like, oh my God, there are other people out in the world who are feeling this way, and I'm not alone. And there is some help out there. And if somebody can take a nugget from something that I share or something that someone else who shares a story shares, then that's the whole purpose.
Wow. And that's the reason why Podcast with Sheila was actually set up to
Mm,
have people share their stories and let others know that whatever you're going through is not unique to you. People have been through it. So by
yes.
listening to some of these real stories, you get to know how they navigated the path when they found themselves there. And that
Mhm.
will probably give you encouragement to go through those difficult times. So I'm
Yeah.
excited we're talking about this today. But as a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project, your support with LGBTQ plus youth in distress. What are the most pressing issues they face today, and how can they be supported?
Well, I think right now, unfortunately, so many of us in this country in particular are dealing with a political crisis that we don't know how to handle. It's terrifying for a lot of people, especially within the queer community, and within the queer community, especially within the transgender community. So, I mean, the LGBTQ community is a marginalized community to begin with, and we all know that marginalized communities are are under attack more often, unfortunately, than other communities. So they're already under attack, and now they're getting hit kind of from all sides. So people are afraid of their rights being taken away. People are afraid of gay marriage being rescinded. People are afraid that they don't get the life affirming, gender affirming care that they need. That's huge right now. Um, People are pretty consistently on the Trevor Lifeline dealing with issues relating to coming out and being supported. Perhaps they don't have a family who is going to support them, and they don't know what to do, and they don't have anyone else to lean into. So we hear that a lot. We hear lots of abuse issues going on within family dynamics. So it's talking about it again. I always kind of defer to the same answer, like, what can we do, how can we help everyone? It's by keeping communication lines open. It's by being a good member of the community, if that's your community. It's about being a good ally if you're an ally to that community. It's about asking questions. It's about showing up, and it's about offering your support. Like, that's the most that any of us can do. Just non-judgmentally listen and be there to support when someone is afraid, because when you're afraid, there's nothing worse than feeling like you have no options and not knowing where
Mm,
to turn.
wow. Suicide and mental illness still carries a stigma despite
Mhm.
progress. What are some practical ways people can contribute to normalizing these conversations?
Well, I think talking about them in the mainstream, talking about them, being open about them. A lot of it also has to do with language in particular. I know that in the niche that I'm in, which within the bigger mental health space and mental illness category, it's suicide. And I know in my case, I talk an awful lot with people about how language matters. The way that we talk about things makes a difference. It's what creates that stigma, because when you think about how things develop, they develop because of the way that we engage around them, or the way that we talk and the word choices that we use. So, for instance, saying committed suicide, I know it's very common. A lot of people say it and have
Yeah.
said it for decades and decades. What a lot of people don't realize is that the mental health community as a whole is trying to move away from having people say committed suicide, because the connotation around the word committed is negative. People don't want to be associated with committing a crime, committing a sin, committing some kind of an immoral act. And when you attach a word like committed to a word like suicide, the person who performed that act is now just instantly stigmatized. So we're trying to move away from that and say things like died by suicide or ended their life or suicided. And that's just one example of how we change the game and how we kind of crack through that stigma and normalize having these kinds of conversations. We have to just pick and choose a little bit more intentionally how we talk about those things.
Wow. I've always said that words are powerful, and I think that that's something you've emphasized on. The way we use words goes a very long way to harm or to make somebody. So we have to be very careful of the things we say. In saying that, we'll be wrapping up quite soon. So if you've got any questions, you can leave them on any of the platforms you are on now, and I'll be careful to read it before we finally sign out. So if you could leave our listeners with one message about mental health, suicide loss, or resilience, what would that be?
I would just say to anybody who might be listening, especially people who might be listening who are struggling right now with whatever it is that you might be struggling. It doesn't have to be necessarily with suicidal thoughts or, you know, depression. It could just be whatever your challenge is in the moment. You won't always feel this way. It won't always be the way that it is right now. There's another side to it, and we do have to sit in it. Whatever it is that we're dealing with, we do have to sit in it because that's how we get through it. But there is another side to it, and there's help. There is help. Even if you're someone who doesn't have an immediate support system, maybe doesn't have a partner or a family you can lean into, there are places like the Trevor Project. There are places like the 988 Lifeline or the crisis text line where you can reach out and you can talk to people who are designed, trained just to listen and hold space for you and give you support. So just know that there's another side and you're not out there alone.
Wow. Lisa, I would like to say a massive, massive thank you for coming on podcast with Sheila today to talk about suicide and mental health. This is one topic I don't think any of us have discussed well enough, as a lot of people in this day and age are going through so much they can't even talk about because they feel they'll be stigmatized or people are going to look at them in a funny way. But I'm happy we've said a lot today, and hopefully when people have the opportunity to have a chance on this podcast, they're going to learn a lot from you. So thank you very much for coming here today.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you just creating a safe space to have this conversation.
Wow. If you've been listening in, this is season 2 of episode 126 of our podcast series, where we bring seasoned guests with inspiring real life stories and experiences to share with us. Do not miss out on all these lovely experiences. Subscribe and be notified when a new episode is released. Whilst at it, please drop us a rating, and remember, change begins with you. Until we meet again, have a brilliant day. Thank you.
Thank you.